Reed was another key ally for the early neoliberal movement and was the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, today considered one of the oldest libertarian organizations in the United States. Earlier in March 1946, Reed acquired a loan from the Volcker Fund to purchase a large property in Irvington, New York, which he transformed into the headquarters of the F.E.E. The F.E.E. specialized in publishing books, articles, and pamphlets that unflinchingly championed the superiority of a free market society. Like Leno and Miller, Reed was also remarkably inflexible in his zeal for free market capitalism, and even criticized Simon's posthumously published Economic Policy for a Free Society in a letter to Director, who actually wrote the book's prefatory note. Some of us here have carefully gone over the galleys of Economic Policy for a Free Society by Henry Simons. We had hoped this was a piece we might assist in distributing, but it is so well loaded with the advocacy of collectivistic ideas that it falls entirely out of our field. The book states many positions with which we are in agreement, but personally, I do not believe that the cause of individual liberty in a free market economy will be aided by it. Figures like Leno, Reed, and Miller, who were now thoroughly enmeshed in the pro-market academic research they were commissioning, had no use for the anti-monopoly liberalism of Simons. Like the neoliberals themselves, they wanted a reformulation of liberalism, but molded to meet the present moment. They wanted to compound the advantage of American corporations over the multitude of destroyed countries in the world. They approved of a strong state, as long as it was using its authority to enshrine competition and free enterprise. A strong American state and strong American corporations were the best weapons to fight collectivism at home and abroad during the Cold War. And above all, they were eager to roll back the New Deal and eradicate the scourge of labor union activism across the United States. In Hayek and his followers, these figures found the intellectual ammunition they needed to fight the post-war paradigm. Here we begin to see how Hayek's willingness to collaborate with the anti-New Deal faction began to have unforeseen consequences. From the moment of the study's creation at Chicago, Hayek was now forced to moderate influences of different factions within his international neoliberal movement, including the growing American libertarian contingent. But even Hayek, who was respected by every distinct group within the Mont Pelerin Society, couldn't always override the men providing the purse for his activities. In 1950, with only 2 years remaining in the free market studies duration, Leno threatened to remove Director from his leadership position if he didn't jettison the anti-monopoly ideas of Simons. It is at this moment that we begin to witness the perspective shifts of Director, Friedman, and Levi on monopoly power. Director's shift on monopoly power first appeared in his review of the book Unions and Capitalism by Charles Lindblom in 1950. In the review, Director boldly claimed that competitive forces located in the supply side of the market were capable of undoing monopoly power. According to Director, the corroding influence of competition has the effective tendency to destroy all types of monopoly, essentially taking the classical liberal notion that monopoly could suppress competition and flipping it on its head. To the ordo liberals, the notion of a monopoly that could spur competition would have appeared as an oxymoron, but Director doubled down on this idea in 1951, writing that the corporate form was ideal specifically because a corporation that achieved monopoly status would simultaneously trigger its own demise by inviting competitors to out-innovate that monopoly. Thus, even industries dominated by massive corporations were still perfectly competitive. Milton Friedman, Director's brother-in-law, came to similar conclusions in the same time frame. Friedman is a massive figure in neoliberal history, whose influence on economic thinking during the Cold War period is difficult to overstate. He was an economic advisor from the 1960s to the 1980s to Barry Goldwater and Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan, and also served as the president of the Mont Pelerin Society from 1970 to 1972. His major contributions to neoliberal thought begin with the highly intriguing article written in 1951 entitled Neoliberalism and Its Prospects. The first interesting aspect of this article is that it is one of the first and few writings in history that transparently identifies itself as neoliberal. It is also a remarkably helpful document for understanding the development of neoliberalism, but only up to this point in history. Like Hayek, Friedman insisted that laissez-faire liberalism and Keynesian intervention had both failed, highlighting the need for the new faith, as Friedman put it, of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism would accept the 19th century liberal emphasis on the fundamental importance of the individual, but it would substitute for the 19th century goal of laissez-faire as a means to this end, the goal of the competitive order. It would seek to use competition among producers to protect consumers from exploitation, competition among employers to protect workers and owners of property, and competition among consumers to protect the enterprises themselves. The state would police the system, establish conditions favorable to competition and prevent monopoly, provide a stable monetary framework, and relieve acute misery and distress. The citizens would be protected against the state by the existence of a free private market and against one another by the preservation of competition. But soon after the publication of this article, Friedman and the rest of the free market study diverged from their anti-monopoly roots. Friedman now claimed that monopoly persisted only when governments supported them. Like Director, Friedman claimed that monopolies were highly visible and therefore targets for competition, but also argued that the effective power of monopoly over prices and wages tends to be considerably exaggerated, further portraying monopolies as relatively harmless. Friedman especially would become known throughout his career for his sanguine view of competition as a panacea for all kinds of economic difficulty, and his time in the free market study was the origin of that public stance. The last major contributor to the free market study was Edward Levi, a law professor at Chicago who would go on to be the university's president and then the U.S. Attorney General under the Ford administration later in life. In 1947, Levi publicly registered his opposition to monopoly power, stating, "The fact of the matter is that there is enormous concentration in the American economy today and enormous amount of monopoly, a situation that he attributed to weak antitrust laws." By 1956, long after the free market study had concluded, Levi had arrived at the opposite conclusion, stating, "Since economic theory demonstrates that the presence of monopoly is much more often alleged than confirmed, less rather than more regulation ought to be prescribed." Close to the end of the free market study, the new bent of the Chicago School was beginning to be noticed by others. The old Chicago economist Jacob Viner, who had left Chicago for Princeton in 1946, the same year that the free market study began, recalled his experience at a Volcker-funded conference organized by Director and Levi in 1951. Everything about the conference except the unscheduled statements and protests from individual participants were so patently rigidly structured, so loaded, that I got more amusement from the conference than from any other I ever attended. Even the source of the financing of the conference, as I found out later, was ideologically loaded. Leno must have felt he was receiving a tremendous return on his investment. The University of Chicago became the first of several important outposts for the Mont Pelerin Society and its wealthy sponsors to inject neoliberalism into the bloodstream of American academia and therefore into its politics. Leno was clearly committed to playing the long game, even though he never got specifically what he asked for in the first place, which was an American road to serfdom. But after 16 long years of waiting, he actually did get what he asked Hayek for all those years ago. Only, it wasn't Hayek who delivered it, or even Aaron Director. It came in the form of Milton Friedman's most famous book, Capitalism and Freedom. Capitalism and Freedom, published in 1962 by University of Chicago Press, 18 years after the Road to Serfdom, is thoroughly neoliberal in the New Chicago style, and even reveals itself to be a Volcker product in the opening sentences of its original preface. This book is a long-delayed product of a series of lectures that I gave in June 1956 at a conference sponsored by the Volcker Foundation. The economic and political prescriptions contained within the book are some of the most clearly articulated neoliberal positions ever published. Political freedom is inextricably linked to, and derived from, economic freedom. The Bretton Woods system should be ended, its controls and fixed exchange rates discarded in favor of floating exchange rates. Federal expenditures destabilize the economy, contrary to the advice of Keynes. Public school systems ought to be privatized and replaced with vouchers. Fair employment practices laws inhibit the freedom of employers. Government intervention is the most common form of monopoly. The progressive income tax ought to be abolished. And the concept of social responsibility, that corporations ought to care about their communities and not just profit, is inimical to the capitalist system and can only lead to totalitarianism. And then, in the ultimate tribute to Leno, Friedman said the quiet part out loud. For advocacy of capitalism to mean anything, the proponents must be able to finance their cause. Radical movements in capitalist societies have typically been supported by a few wealthy individuals, a role of inequality in wealth in preserving political freedom that is seldom noted. As we can see, by the time Capitalism and Freedom arrived in 1962, neoliberalism had left the anti-monopoly positions of Simons and the order liberals in the dust. The ease with which the New Chicago economists had waved away concerns about monopoly power was emblematic of a new, comprehensive neoliberal worldview that blithely considered any analysis of political power irrelevant to economic analysis. In this new alternative universe, being an intellectual for hire was a badge of honor. Publishing research that philosophically justified the commodification of academic spaces not only protected freedom, but was simply good economics. Only 17 years after the end of World War II, neoliberalism had transformed from a questionable yet coherent response to Keynesian liberalism into a naked lust for consolidating wealth and power into the hands of those opposed to the post-war consensus. Aaron Director, who wrote the prefatory note of Simon's posthumously published work, Economic Policy for a Free Society, remembered his friend like this: "In the work of Henry Simons, we find a combination of talents which is rare indeed. He was a first-rate economic theorist, he had an original mind, and he developed a distinguished literary style. We have to believe that the additional work which Henry Simons would have accomplished will ultimately be done by others. And yet, this is but small comfort for the personal loss of those of us he befriended. The work Simon's old friends like Director, Hayek, and Friedman did to honor him was to step over his corpse, and then propel Chicago, and the rest of the world, into monopoly neoliberalism."